Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam with Historic Travels, and as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys, I appreciate it. And if any of you guys would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the Historic Travels YouTube channel a little bit more, I did create a Patreon, and there has been a complete overhaul on that. I will post a link to that down in the description. Thank you guys, I appreciate it. Alright guys, well now let's get into today's topic. As we all know, April 10th is quickly approaching, and that will be the 109th anniversary of the RMS Titanic departing Southampton for its maiden voyage. And when that day comes up, we're going to be covering the events of the Titanic's timeline of events leading up to the sinking, talk about things that happened during the sea days, etc., etc. But before that, I thought we would try to squeeze in one more video about a very underrated, or maybe a topic that isn't that highly talked about in the Titanic community. People who are really interested in the Titanic know about this, but people who have a casual interest in the ship don't tend to know about this group of people. I want to talk about a group of men whose influence on board the RMS Titanic during the voyage and the night she sank made a huge difference in the number of lives that were saved that night. I believe that these men, if they hadn't been there, the sinking would have played out entirely different. And honestly, I think we would have had a greater loss of life than what we really did on the night that the Titanic went down. I am, of course, referring to a group of men known as the Guarantee Group.
So what exactly was the Guarantee Group on Titanic? Well, essentially the Guarantee Group was a group of men that worked on the RMS Titanic while it was under construction at the shipyard at Harland and Wolff. And you see, these men were such a huge influence and such a big help while the ship was being constructed that Harland and Wolff selected them to go with the Titanic during the ship's maiden voyage. And essentially their role on board the ship was just to be a troubleshooting team, so to speak. So while they were on board the ship, they would deal with any problems if they should come up, and basically just try to make the maiden voyage of the Titanic as safe and as perfect as it could possibly be.
So now that you have a basic understanding of the Guarantee Group, let's now talk about how difficult it would be to actually become a member of this group. So you see, at the time of the RMS Titanic's construction, Harland and Wolff had 14,000 men employed, and all of them would like to have a shot at getting into the Guarantee Group. But of those 14,000 men, there would only be 10 selected for the group. But you see, 10 isn't even a complete number. Out of those 10 spots, several were already designated or, assigned to people who were heavily involved in the design and construction of the Olympic class and the RMS Titanic. A good example would be Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews was one of the main designers of the Titanic, so of course he would have a spot in the group. So there were actually only around 7 or 8 slots available for the men who were actually building Titanic to actually have a shot to get into this group.
But for the men building Titanic, even though the chances of them getting into the Guarantee Group were slim, that didn't really matter to them. All they all were trying to do was just do the best job that they could to build these ships as safe and as reliable as possible, and try to prove their worth so that they may still have a shot to get into the Guarantee Group. What you have to remember, life in Ireland in the days of Titanic was not easy. There were not a lot of good jobs to come by, let alone job security. So these men just kept doing the best job that they could to build these new ships in hopes that they may actually have a shot to get into the Guarantee Group.
Even though it was incredibly difficult to get into the Guarantee Group, it wasn't impossible. And not all the positions went to people that were just heavily involved with, the initial planning and construction of the Titanic. You see, there were several people in the Guarantee Group who actually worked their way up from nothing. The first person that comes to mind was a man named Alfie Cunningham. You see, he was young, ambitious. I believe he was around 17 when he first started working at the White Star Line, or Harland and Wolff. And he worked his way up from nothing. And he just worked hard, and then when Titanic was done, he actually earned his spot in the Guarantee Group. And when he first started Harland and Wolff, he had no knowledge of ships whatsoever. But through hard work and determination, he actually made a name for himself in the shipyard and actually got a spot on the RMS Titanic during its maiden voyage.
Now that you have a basic understanding of the Guarantee Group, let's now jump ahead to when the Titanic was completed and getting ready to depart on her maiden voyage, and meet the 10 lucky men that were selected to be with this vessel on its maiden voyage in the Guarantee Group. The first member of the Guarantee Group was Thomas Andrews. He was one of the key designers of the RMS Titanic and the Olympic class of ocean liners, so naturally he'd be selected for the Guarantee Group. The second member of the Guarantee Group was a man by the name of William Campbell. Now, even though this photo shows him as a child, he was actually 20 years old at the time of the Titanic sailing. This was just the only photo of him that I could find. But he was one of the few people that actually worked his way up from nothing and was selected to be a member of the Guarantee Group just for his hard work and determination in the shipyard. The third member was Roderick Chisholm. Now, Roderick Chisholm had been employed at Harland & Wolff for over 20 years and was heavily involved in the design and construction of the RMS Olympic and the RMS Titanic. The fourth member was Anthony Wood Frost. He was one of the foremen in charge of dealing with installing machinery and stuff inside the RMS Olympic and the RMS Titanic. So he would naturally be one of the people that would be selected for the guarantee group. The next member is Robert Knight. He was essentially an engine fitter on board the RMS Titanic during its construction and was selected for the guarantee group to ensure smooth operations of the Titanic's machinery and engines on the maiden voyage. The next member was William Henry Marsh Parr. He was essentially in charge of all of the Titanic's electrical systems and their installation while the ship was being built, and was sent along with the guarantee group to make sure that everything ran smoothly.
Now, there are 4 more members of the guarantee group. There's 10 in total, but I could not find pictures for the last 4, so I'm just going to have to briefly mention who they were and what their roles were on the maiden voyage. The next person on the list is Alfie Cunningham. I briefly mentioned him earlier, and he was one of the people who actually worked his way up from nothing. He was essentially like an ambitious, very motivated individual, and he proved his worth in the shipyard and earned a spot on the RMS Titanic as a member of the guarantee group. The next member of the guarantee group was a man named Francis Parks, and during the ship's construction, he was heavily involved in the installation of all of the Titanic's plumbing systems. The next member we need to mention is Joseph Thompson. Now, he is actually a very interesting person because he was the only member of the guarantee group to survive the Titanic, and the only reason he survived was because he wasn't there at the time. He was the only member of the guarantee group to disembark the Titanic in Southampton. He was basically a foreman, in charge of overseeing the painting of the RMS Titanic. But because he got off the ship in Southampton, he was the only member of the guarantee group to survive. And the final member of the guarantee group was a man named Enos Watson, and he was basically an apprentice at Harland & Wolff during the ship's construction, and he was brilliant at mathematics and electronics, so he was selected to go with the RMS Titanic as part of one of the guarantee group.
I honestly can't imagine what the people that were selected for the guarantee group must have felt, especially those who had worked their way up from nothing in the shipyard. Just think about it, being one of the people who was heavily involved in the construction of the Titanic, and then to have your work recognized and be selected to go with the ship on its maiden voyage. What an incredible honor that must have been for the few men who were selected to be part of the guarantee group.
Now, as mentioned earlier in this video, with the exception of the one man who actually disembarked the Titanic in Southampton, none of the other members of the guarantee group would survive the sinking of the Titanic. And you see, their actions during the sinking are kind of hit and miss. We don't know a lot about what happened to a majority of these men. However, we do know some things, and the one member of the guarantee group that we do know the most about was Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer. You see, he was heavily involved in the evacuation of the RMS Titanic and helped a lot of people escape. So we do know a lot about him, but we do know a story about Mr. Frost. You see, at some point throughout the sinking, Thomas Andrews went down to the Titanic's engine room where Mr. Frost was and told him that the Titanic did not have much time to live, and if you stay here, you will die. Mr. Frost told Thomas Andrews, "We will stay here as long as we need to be here." So just hearing that line, I honestly believe that all the members of the guarantee group stayed at their posts until the end. They never left. I really think that they did the best job that they could to try to keep the Titanic afloat as long as possible. Keep the power going for the lights, for the Marconi wireless, to help the lifeboats leave. I think that those men stayed at their posts and did everything they possibly could in order to save as many lives as possible on the night that the RMS Titanic went down.
And to me, the members of the engineering staff, the guarantee group, whatever, they were the true heroes on board the RMS Titanic that night. Now, don't misunderstand me. There were a lot of heroes on board this ship that night. The officers that got the lifeboats away, Jack Phillips, Harold Bride, the wireless operators, there were a lot of heroes on the Titanic that night. But what makes the engineering staff and the members of the guarantee group different is that they knew by staying at their post, they would not survive the evening. They chose to stay behind, to keep the Titanic's lights on, to keep essential functions on the ship working. By doing this, they not only delayed the sinking, but they also guaranteed that 700 people would be able to evacuate the Titanic. Just imagine if they would have abandoned their posts. I think the power on the Titanic would have went out a lot sooner. I think because those men sacrificed their lives, that over 700 people were able to survive the sinking of the RMS Titanic.
Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. And yeah, now you know the story of the Guarantee Group on board the RMS Titanic. And also, before you guys go, don't forget, tomorrow is April 10th. And you know what that means. Tomorrow is the 109th anniversary of the day the RMS Titanic left Southampton to begin its maiden voyage. So if you would like to see all the videos that we're going to be posting on this channel covering the Titanic story, please make sure you're subscribed. Please give this video a like and also hit the bell icon so you don't miss any future videos. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed this video. All right, everybody. Well, hey, you all have a good evening, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good night, everybody.